The Bible reveals what happens after death according to God's oldest writings. There is a moment that no one can escape. It does not ask for permission, it does not wait for readiness, and it does not negotiate with fear or belief. It arrives with precision. And in that exact instant, everything you have trusted as solid begins to dissolve. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with a silence so absolute that it confronts you with a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. What happens next? The oldest biblical writings do not describe death as an ending. They describe it as a crossing, a passage that separates what is temporary from what has always been real. This is not philosophy, and it is not metaphor. It is presented as a structured transition, governed by the same authority that gave life in the beginning. And here's what makes this deeply unsettling. According to those ancient texts, the moment after death is not empty. It is not a void. It is not unconscious oblivion. It is an unveiling. What you have called reality begins to lose its dominance, and something else takes its place. Something that does not depend on your senses, your body, or your understanding. The scriptures, in their earliest layers, point to a continuity of existence that does not pause, does not reset, and does not disappear. It continues, but under a different order. Now consider this carefully. Many people have been taught to believe in immediate reward or instant punishment. Others have accepted the idea of a deep, dreamless sleep. But when you return to the oldest writings, you begin to see a more complex and more precise picture emerging. One that does not rely on assumption, but on a consistent pattern of divine intention. This changes everything. Because if death is not the end, and if what comes after is not random, then your life is not isolated from eternity. Every thought, every choice, every intention carries weight beyond what you can measure now. The life you are living is not just happening, it is aligning you with what comes next. And here is the part most people never stop to consider. If there is a defined moment of transition, then that moment must have a beginning. A precise point where the physical and the spiritual no longer move together. A moment where something separates, and that separation reveals more than anything you have experienced before. That is where this journey truly begins. Not after death is completed, but in the very instant it starts. The last instant before the veil. There is a point where the human body reaches its limit, but according to the oldest biblical understanding, that is not where the story ends. That is where something else begins to unfold with remarkable precision. Death is not described as a collapse into nothingness. It is described as a release, a deliberate separation between what was formed from the earth and what was given directly by God. In Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 7, it is written that the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. This statement is direct and intentional. It does not suggest confusion or randomness. It describes a movement with direction. The body does not vanish, it returns. The spirit does not wander, it goes back. Now think about the weight of that. If something returns, it means it is recognized. It has origin, identity, and destination. The breath of life, first described in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, was not created by human means. It was given. And what is given by God is not lost in disorder. It follows a path. This means that the final instant before death is not empty. It is structured. It is the exact moment where the unity between body and life force is interrupted. And that interruption is not chaotic. It is precise. The physical begins to yield, but something within does not fade with it. The ancient Hebrew perspective does not portray this moment with panic. It carries a sense of inevitability, but also of order. As if every human being, regardless of belief or awareness, reaches a point where the design of existence takes over completely. There is no more control, no more delay, no more distraction, only transition. And here is where it becomes even more profound. This moment is not described as the end of awareness, but as the threshold of a different kind of perception. The senses tied to the body begin to shut down, but that does not necessarily mean the experience ends. It may mean the experience changes. So the question shifts. It is no longer about whether something happens at death. It becomes about what is actually experienced in that first separation. What does it mean for the spirit to return? What does it encounter? And how immediate is that transition? Because what comes next is not what most people have been taught to expect. It challenges assumptions about silence, about unconsciousness, and even about time itself. The silence that speaks, when life ceases. There is a kind of silence that terrifies people, not because of what it contains, but because of what it seems to remove. When the body stops, when the voice is gone, when movement ceases, everything that defined presence in the physical world disappears. From the outside, it looks like absence. It looks like nothing remains. But the oldest biblical writings challenge that perception in a way that most have never fully considered. In the book of Psalms, chapter 6, verse 5, it is written that in death there is no remembrance, and in the grave there is no praise. At first glance, this sounds like total silence, a complete shutdown of awareness. But the original context reveals something more precise. It is not speaking about non-existence. It is describing the absence of expression as it was known in life. The silence after death is not necessarily emptiness. It is the removal of earthly function. No voice raised in worship, no actions carried out in the physical world, no participation in the rhythms of human life. But that does not automatically mean the end of all perception. It means the end of expression through the body. This distinction is critical, because if the body is no longer the instrument, then whatever remains is no longer bound by physical limitation. The silence is not proof of nothingness. It is evidence of transition. Now consider how unsettling this becomes. If what we call silence is actually a shift in dimension, then what appears inactive from our perspective may not be inactive at all. It may simply be inaccessible to those who are still living within the constraints of the physical world. The ancient understanding of death often points to a realm where activity is not defined by movement, sound, or visible interaction. It is a state where the familiar markers of life no longer apply. And because of that, it is easily misunderstood as emptiness. But the scriptures never describe God as the author of confusion. If there is a transition, then there is purpose. If there is a state beyond physical life, then it is not undefined. It is simply beyond what human senses can measure. This leads to a deeper question. If the silence is not emptiness, then what is actually taking place in that state? Is there awareness without expression? Is there presence without movement? And if so, what does that reveal about the true nature of existence beyond the body? Because what comes next begins to peel back another layer. A layer that forces us to reconsider what it truly means to be alive and what it means to continue after life, even when everything visible has come to an end. The invisible separation. Body, soul, and breath of life. There is a moment in the process of death that cannot be seen, measured, or captured by any human instrument. Yet it is one of the most defining transitions described in the oldest biblical writings. It is the separation that reveals what a human being truly is beneath the physical form. Not just flesh and bone, but something formed by layers that do not all belong to the earth. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it is written that God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. This is not a poetic description. It is a structural explanation of human existence. The body comes from the earth, the breath comes from God, and the result is a living being. Now consider what happens when that unity is undone. The dust does not cease to exist. It returns to its origin. The breath does not disappear. It returns to the one who gave it. But what about the living soul, the identity, the awareness, the sense of self that existed between those two elements? This is where the separation becomes more than physical. It becomes revelatory. The ancient texts do not describe humans as owning life independently. Life is sustained by the breath of God. And when that breath is withdrawn, the body cannot maintain what it once held together. But this is not destruction. It is disassembly. The components return to their source, but the question that remains is what happens to the continuity of the person. The scriptures suggest that identity is not rooted in the physical body alone. If it were, there would be no reason to describe the return of the spirit with such precision. The invisible separation is not chaotic. It follows the same order in which life was first given. What came from the earth returns to the earth. What came from God returns to God. This reveals something profound. Human life is not self-contained. It is sustained by a constant connection to the divine source. And here's where most people misunderstand the process. They assume that once the body fails, everything that defined the person dissolves with it. But the biblical structure suggests otherwise. It implies that what made you aware, what allowed you to think, to choose, to recognize truth, was never fully dependent on the physical form. It was expressed through it, but not created by it. This raises a question that cannot be ignored. If the body and the breath separate, and if the identity is not entirely bound to the body, then what carries that identity forward? What preserves the continuity of the person beyond the moment of separation? Because the next stage does not leave that question unanswered. It begins to reveal whether awareness continues, and if it does, in what form and under what conditions. The first contact with eternity. There is a moment immediately after separation that no human being has ever been able to describe from experience and return to explain. Yet the oldest biblical writings give strong indications that this moment is not empty, not delayed, and not without significance. It is the first contact with eternity, and it happens without transition time as we understand it. Human thinking depends on sequence. We expect a pause between events, a gap where nothing happens. But the scriptures consistently challenge this idea when it comes to the spiritual realm. In the perspective of God, there is no delay. What follows death is not a waiting room in the way the human mind imagines. It is an immediate shift into a different order of existence. This is where the concept of awareness becomes unavoidable. In the book of Job, chapter 14, verse 21, there is a reflection on whether the dead know anything about what happens to their children after they are gone. The question itself reveals something important. It acknowledges the possibility of awareness, but it also highlights a separation from earthly events. Awareness may exist, but not in connection with the world left behind. Now consider what this implies. If awareness is no longer tied to the physical body, then it operates under different conditions. It is no longer dependent on senses like sight or hearing as we know them. It is not limited by space or physical boundaries. But that does not mean it is undefined. It means it is governed by a different reality. The first contact with eternity is not described as confusion. It is described through patterns that suggest recognition. Not recognition of people or places as we know them, but recognition of truth. A clarity that is not filtered through emotion, denial, or misunderstanding. Everything that was once blurred by human limitation is now exposed. And here is where the weight of this moment becomes undeniable. If the first contact with eternity brings clarity, then it also removes illusion. Every belief, every justification, every hidden intention is no longer protected by the complexity of human reasoning. What remains is what is real. This is not presented as a moment of negotiation. It is not a time where new decisions are made. The scriptures point to this as a revealing, not a rewriting. What has been formed during life is now encountered without distortion. That alone should shift how we think about existence. Because if the first moment after death reveals truth instead of offering new choices, then everything that shapes that moment must happen before it. It must happen now, while life is still active, while decisions are still being made. And this leads to a deeper realization. If eternity begins with clarity, then what lies beyond that first contact is not random. It follows a structure, a reality that has existed long before human life and continues beyond it. The next step begins to uncover that reality, not as imagination, but as something the ancient writings consistently point toward, even when human language struggles to fully express it. Dimensions unseen, the world beyond human perception. There is a limitation every human being shares, and most never question it. Everything we call real is filtered through senses that were designed for this world only. Sight, hearing, touch, all of it is calibrated for the physical environment. But the oldest biblical writings repeatedly suggest that reality is not confined to what the human body can detect. This means something critical. When death removes the body, it does not remove reality. It removes the filter. Throughout the scriptures, there are moments where this hidden dimension briefly becomes visible, not imagined, not symbolic, but revealed. In the book of 2 Kings, chapter 6, verse 17, the servant of the prophet is terrified because he sees only the physical threat surrounding him. But when his eyes are opened, he sees something that was always there, an unseen host, a spiritual reality occupying the same space yet completely invisible to ordinary perception. This is not an isolated idea. It establishes a pattern. There is more happening than what human senses can capture, and the physical world is only one layer of a much larger structure. Now apply that understanding to death. If the body is what limits perception, then the removal of the body does not lead to blindness. It may lead to exposure, not to imagination, but to a level of reality that was always present but never accessible. This changes the way we understand what comes next. The transition after death is not a movement to a distant location in the way we think about distance. It is a shift in dimension. A shift from what is seen to what has always existed beyond sight. And here is where it becomes deeply unsettling for many people. If there are dimensions beyond human perception, then the spiritual realm is not empty. It is structured. It contains order, presence, and purpose. It is not undefined space. It is governed. The ancient texts never describe this unseen world as chaotic. They describe it as organized under divine authority. That means what exists beyond perception is not random. It follows a design, a system that reflects the nature of God Himself. So the question becomes unavoidable. When a person crosses beyond the physical, what part of that unseen reality do they encounter? What determines where they stand within that structure? Because if the unseen world is real, and if it is ordered, then entry into it is not without consequence or direction. It is not neutral. And what comes next begins to reveal something even more personal. Not just where one enters, but what one carries into that reality. Something that does not disappear with the body, something that remains intact even when everything physical is left behind. Echoes of the soul, memory, identity, and continuity. There is one question that quietly unsettles almost everyone when they begin to think seriously about death. If the body is left behind, does anything of who I am remain? Not just existence, but identity, memory, recognition, the sense of being a distinct person. The oldest biblical writings do not ignore this question. In fact, they approach it in a way that suggests the answer is far more complex than most assume. Human identity is often tied to the body. Facial features, voice, habits, expressions. But none of these define the core of who a person is. They express it, but they do not create it. The scriptures consistently point to something deeper, an inner continuity that is not dependent on physical form. In the book of 1 Samuel chapter 28, there is a controversial and often misunderstood account where the prophet Samuel is recognized after death. What stands out is not the method of the encounter, but the recognition itself. Identity is not lost. It is not erased. It remains distinct enough to be acknowledged. Now consider what that implies. If identity persists beyond the body, then memory is not strictly a function of the brain. It may be expressed through it during life, but it is not entirely contained within it. This suggests that what you have experienced, what you have chosen, what you have become, is not discarded at death. But this does not mean memory functions the same way. The ancient writings hint at a shift, a separation from earthly concerns, from ongoing events, from the unfolding of time as we know it. There is continuity of identity, but not necessarily continuity of involvement with the world left behind. This creates a tension that is difficult to ignore. You remain who you are, but you are no longer part of the environment that shaped your daily awareness. Your identity is intact, but your context has changed completely. And here is where it becomes deeply personal. If identity continues, then nothing that formed that identity is irrelevant. Every decision, every belief, every internal posture carries forward. Not hidden, not diluted, but preserved. This challenges a common assumption that death resets everything. That whatever was done, thought, or believed fades away with the body. The scriptures suggest the opposite. They point to continuity, not erasure. So the real question is not whether identity survives. The question is what kind of identity continues. What has been formed within you that remains when everything external is removed? Because what comes next begins to reveal that this identity is not only preserved, it is also examined, not by human standards, not by comparison with others, but by something far more absolute. The invisible record, a life that remains written. There is a dimension of existence that most people never consider while they are alive, not because it is hidden, but because it does not respond to human denial. It is the idea that nothing is truly lost, nothing is forgotten, and nothing disappears simply because it is no longer visible. The oldest biblical writings point to a reality where every life leaves a trace that does not fade with time or death. This is not about memory in the human sense. Human memory fails, distorts, and forgets. But the scriptures describe something far more precise. In the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12, verse 14, it is written that God will bring every work into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. This is not a warning built on fear. It is a statement of structure. It reveals that life is being recorded in a way that is not dependent on human awareness. Now consider what that means. Every intention, every action, every word, even those that were never spoken aloud, carries weight beyond the moment it occurs. Not because of human observation, but because of divine awareness. Nothing is overlooked, nothing is dismissed, everything is accounted for. This introduces the concept of an invisible record, not written with ink or stored in a physical place, but established within the order of God Himself. It is not something external to your existence. It is tied to who you are. It reflects not just what you have done, but what you have become. And here is where this becomes deeply confronting. If your life is recorded in this way, then death does not erase your story. It preserves it. What you carry beyond the physical is not just identity, it is a complete reflection of your lived reality. This challenges the belief that time cancels consequences. In human experience, time can distance us from our actions. It can soften memory, reduce impact, and create the illusion that what has passed no longer matters. But in the structure described by the scriptures, time does not erase truth. It holds it. This means that when a person crosses beyond the physical, they do not enter a state of blankness. They carry a complete account of their existence, whether they were aware of it or not. Not as a list, but as a reality that cannot be separated from who they are. And this leads to a question that cannot be ignored. If everything is recorded, if nothing is lost, then what happens when that record is fully revealed? Not partially understood, not interpreted through human reasoning, but seen in its entirety, without distortion. Because what comes next begins to uncover exactly that moment. A moment where nothing remains hidden, and where truth is no longer something you believe, but something you face directly. God's time and human time, when eternity overrides seconds. There is something deeply ingrained in the human mind that shapes how we understand everything, including death. It is the idea of time. Seconds, minutes, years, progression, waiting. Every experience we have is measured, ordered, and limited by time. But the oldest biblical writings introduce a reality that disrupts this entire framework. They reveal that what governs eternity does not follow the same structure. In the book of Psalms, chapter 90, verse 4, it is written that 1,000 years in the sight of God are like yesterday when it passes, or like a watch in the night. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a direct statement about the nature of divine perspective. Time, as humans experience it, does not bind God, and it does not define eternity. Now apply this to what happens after death. If the human body is what anchors us to time, then the removal of the body also removes that anchor. This means that the experience beyond death is no longer governed by sequence, delay, or duration as we understand them. This challenges one of the most common assumptions people hold: the idea of waiting for judgment, waiting for something to happen, waiting for a future event. But if eternity is not bound by time, then waiting may not exist in the way we think. What feels like an interval to us may not exist at all in that dimension. This does not mean that events do not occur. It means they are not experienced through the lens of time progression. There is no past moving into future. There is only presence within what is already established. And here is where this becomes deeply unsettling. If time no longer separates moments, then there is no distance between action and consequence, no delay between truth and recognition. Everything exists in a state where it is fully known. This removes one of the greatest illusions of human life, the belief that there is always more time to change, more time to correct, more time to prepare. But in the structure of eternity, preparation does not happen after death. It happens before. The removal of time does not create confusion. It creates clarity. It removes delay and exposes reality without interruption. What is true becomes immediately present, not gradually revealed. So the question becomes unavoidable. If eternity is not governed by time, then what determines the sequence of what is experienced? If there is no waiting, no progression, then how does one encounter what comes next? Because what follows is not shaped by time, it is shaped by truth. And that truth is not something that unfolds slowly, it is something that stands fully revealed. The encounter with absolute truth. There is a point where every layer of illusion is removed, not gradually, not selectively, but completely. The oldest biblical writings point to a moment after death where truth is no longer something debated, interpreted, or filtered through human reasoning. It becomes something directly encountered, without distortion, without defense, and without escape. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 13, it is written that nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight, and that everything is uncovered and laid bare before him. This is not a distant concept. It defines the nature of what happens when human life transitions into the presence of divine reality. Now consider what this means for the individual. During life, people operate behind layers. Justifications, perceptions, selective memory, and social identity all create a version of truth that feels manageable. A person can believe something about themselves, present something different to others, and hide what they do not want exposed. But none of that structure survives beyond the physical world. The encounter with absolute truth is not a process of discovery. It is a revelation. Everything that was hidden becomes visible. Not only actions, but intentions. Not only decisions, but motivations. The internal world, which was once private and protected, is no longer concealed. This is not presented as a moment of accusation. It is a moment of clarity. The difference is critical. Accusation invites defense. Clarity removes it. There is nothing to argue, nothing to reinterpret, nothing to reshape. What is seen is exactly what is. And here is where the weight of this moment becomes undeniable. If truth is revealed without distortion, then self-deception no longer exists. Every belief you held about yourself is either confirmed or corrected instantly. Every justification is either validated or exposed. This is why the scriptures emphasize that God sees beyond outward appearance. In the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 16, verse 7, it is written that man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. That perspective does not begin after death. It has always been in place. But after death, it is no longer hidden from the individual. The encounter with truth is not delayed. It is not softened. It is exact. And because of that, it carries a weight that cannot be ignored. Not a weight imposed from the outside, but a weight that comes from seeing reality exactly as it is. So the question becomes deeply personal. If everything about you were revealed without distortion, what would remain? Not what others think, not what you have projected, but what is actually true. Because what follows this moment is not random. It is not disconnected from what is revealed. It is directly aligned with it. The weight of earthly choices. There is a reality that many people avoid confronting, not because it is unclear, but because it is deeply personal. Every choice made during life carries a consequence that does not end when the moment passes. The oldest biblical writings present life not as a series of isolated decisions, but as a continuous formation of direction, a shaping of who a person becomes at the core. In Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 19, it is written that life and death are set before you, blessing and curse, and that you are called to choose life. This is not limited to a single decision. It reflects a pattern. Every action, every intention, every response contributes to a trajectory that is being established over time. Now consider what happens when life ends. If time no longer exists in the same way, then the accumulation of choices does not fade. It stands complete, not as separate events, but as a unified reality that defines the person. This means that what you repeatedly choose becomes what you are aligned with. Not what you say you believe, but what you consistently live. The scriptures do not separate belief from action. They reveal that true alignment is demonstrated through both. And here is where this becomes impossible to ignore. During life, people often assume there is room to delay change, that decisions can be revisited later, that consequences can be avoided, that there is always another opportunity to correct direction. But the structure revealed in the biblical texts does not support that assumption beyond death. Once life reaches its end, the pattern is complete. Not because God refuses change, but because the time for formation has passed. What remains is the result of what was built. This is not about isolated mistakes. It is about direction. A life moving toward truth, or a life moving away from it. The weight of choices is not measured by a single moment, but by the consistency of alignment over time. And this introduces a level of accountability that goes beyond surface behavior. It reaches intention. Why something was done. What motivated it. What was pursued when no one else was watching. Because if everything is revealed in truth, and if identity is preserved, then choices are not forgotten. They are integrated into who a person is. So the question becomes unavoidable. What direction has your life been forming? Not in isolated moments, but in consistent pattern. Because what follows is not arbitrary. It is not disconnected from those choices. It is the direct expression of them, under a standard that does not shift, does not bend, and does not fail. The justice that never fails. There is a concept that many struggle to fully accept, not because it lacks evidence, but because it confronts human expectations at the deepest level. It is the idea of perfect justice. Not partial, not delayed, not influenced by status, emotion, or argument. The oldest biblical writings present divine justice as absolute, precise, and incapable of error. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 4, it is written that God is the rock, his work is perfect, and all his ways are justice. A God of truth, without injustice, righteous and upright is he. This is not a description of intention. It is a declaration of nature. Justice is not something God attempts to do. It is what he is. Now consider how different this is from human systems. Human justice is limited. It depends on evidence that can be incomplete, on perception that can be flawed, on judgment that can be influenced. Mistakes are possible. Bias exists. Outcomes are not always accurate. But the scriptures describe a form of justice where none of those limitations apply. Nothing is hidden, nothing is misunderstood, nothing is misinterpreted. Every action, every intention, every detail is known in its entirety. This means judgment is not based on appearance, but on complete truth. And here is where this becomes deeply unsettling for many. If justice is perfect, then it cannot be manipulated. It cannot be avoided through argument, excuse, or comparison. There is no appeal to human standards, no shifting of responsibility, no dilution of truth. But this is not presented as something cruel. It is presented as something necessary. Because without perfect justice, there can be no true order. Without it, truth would remain unresolved, and what is wrong would never be fully addressed. The difficulty comes from how humans perceive justice, often through the lens of punishment. But the biblical perspective is broader. Justice is not only about consequence, it is about alignment. It reveals what is in harmony with God and what is not. And because God's nature does not change, that standard does not change either. It does not adjust to human culture, opinion, or time. It remains constant. This leads to a realization that cannot be ignored. If perfect justice exists, and if every life is fully known, then what follows the revelation of truth is not random. It is measured. It is exact. It is consistent with the nature of God himself. So the question becomes personal again. Not whether justice will occur, but how each life stands within that justice. Not compared to others, but measured against what is absolute. Because what comes next introduces something that seems to stand in tension with justice, yet is inseparable from it. something that does not cancel justice, but works within it in a way that reveals even more about the character of God. The voice of mercy within judgment. There is a tension that has challenged human understanding for generations. How can perfect justice exist alongside mercy? To the human mind, these two often seem opposed. Justice demands accountability. Mercy appears to withhold it. But the oldest biblical writings reveal something far more precise. They show that mercy is not the absence of justice. It is an expression of God's nature operating within it. In the book of Exodus, chapter 34, verses 6 and 7, God is described as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, yet by no means clearing the guilty. This is not contradiction. It is balance. It reveals that mercy does not ignore truth, and justice does not eliminate compassion. Now consider what this means in the context of what happens after death. If every life is revealed, if every action and intention is fully known, then justice alone would demand a complete and exact response to that truth. But the scriptures consistently show that God's response is not mechanical. It is relational. Mercy is not something applied randomly. It is not given without reason. It is connected to alignment, to humility, to the recognition of truth while still in life. It responds to a heart that turns toward God, not one that resists Him. And here is where this becomes deeply important. Mercy is not activated after death as a second chance. The biblical pattern shows that mercy is extended during life, while choices are still being made, while direction can still change. It is available, but it is not imposed. This removes a common misunderstanding, that after death, there is an opportunity to renegotiate, to correct, to revisit decisions. The scriptures do not support that idea. They show that what is established in life is what is encountered beyond it. But they also show something powerful, that no one is without access to mercy while they live. It is offered, extended, and available, not as a way to avoid truth, but as a way to align with it. Mercy does not erase justice. It fulfills it in a way that reflects the full nature of God. It allows for restoration, but only where there has been response. So the question becomes deeply personal again. Not whether mercy exists, but whether it has been received. Not whether it is available, but whether there has been alignment with it while there is still time. Because what follows is not shaped by possibility. It is shaped by what has already been established. And the next step begins to reveal how that final outcome is not a sudden decision, but something that has been progressively revealed from the earliest writings. The final destination, revealed through time. There is a pattern within the oldest biblical writings that many overlook because they expect everything to be explained at once. But that is not how revelation unfolds. It is progressive. It builds layer upon layer, gradually uncovering what was always true but not always fully understood. The reality of what happens after death is not presented in a single statement. It is revealed across time with increasing clarity. In the earliest texts, the understanding of the afterlife is described in terms that are simple but profound. The concept of Sheol appears as a place of the dead, a realm beyond life where human activity as we know it ceases. It is not described with the detailed divisions that appear later. It is presented as a reality, not fully explained but consistently acknowledged. As the scriptures continue, more clarity is introduced. In the book of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, it is written that many who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. This is a shift. It introduces distinction. It reveals that the final outcome is not the same for all. Now consider the significance of that progression. What begins as a general understanding becomes increasingly specific. The idea of a final outcome, a definitive state, is not a later invention. It is a truth that was always present but gradually revealed. This shows something critical about the nature of God. He does not leave humanity without direction. He reveals what is necessary in a way that unfolds over time, allowing understanding to grow. But the consistency remains. There is continuity beyond death, and there is a final state that reflects the alignment of each life. And here is where this becomes deeply personal. The final destination is not determined at the moment of death as a new decision. It is the result of what has already been formed. The progression of revelation in Scripture mirrors the progression of life itself. What is built over time leads to a defined outcome. This removes uncertainty in a way that many find uncomfortable, because it means the final state is not arbitrary. It is not assigned without basis. It is consistent with truth, with justice, and with the response each person has had to that truth. The unfolding of this revelation across the Scriptures serves a purpose. It removes ignorance. It leaves no one without insight into what lies ahead. The information is not hidden. It is available, but it requires attention, reflection, and response. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the final destination has been revealed, even progressively, then what remains is not a lack of knowledge, but a decision about how to respond to it. Because everything now leads to one final realization, one that brings the entire journey into focus in a way that cannot be ignored. When eternity begins before the end. There is a truth that changes everything once it is fully understood, and most people spend their lives overlooking it because they assume eternity is something that begins after death. But the oldest biblical writings point in a different direction. They reveal that eternity does not start when life ends. It starts while life is still being lived. This means that what comes after death is not disconnected from what is happening now. It is not a separate story. It is the continuation of a path already in motion. Every thought, every decision, every direction taken is not just shaping temporary outcomes, it is forming alignment with something eternal. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 30, verse 20, it is written that loving God, obeying His voice, and holding fast to Him is your life and length of days. This is not limited to physical survival, it points to something deeper. Life in its fullest sense is defined by connection to God, not after death, but now. Now consider what this means in light of everything that has been revealed. If truth is encountered after death, if identity continues, if every action is accounted for, if justice is perfect, and if mercy is offered during life, then the present moment carries a weight that cannot be ignored. There is no division between now and eternity. There is only continuity. This removes one of the greatest misconceptions people hold. The idea that there will be a moment later to prepare, to adjust, to reconsider. But the structure presented in the Scriptures makes it clear that preparation does not happen after the final breath. It happens before it. Eternity is not waiting in the future. It is already intersecting with the present through every choice that is made, through every moment where truth is either accepted or ignored, through every decision that either aligns with God or moves away from Him. And here is the final realization that cannot be avoided. The question is no longer what happens after death. The question is what is happening right now that is defining what comes after. Because death does not create your eternity. It reveals it. What you are becoming today is what you will encounter when everything else is stripped away. Not what you intended, not what you assumed, but what is true. And that truth is already being formed.